Yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm Joaquin Lugo. I'll be giving a talk on responsible authorship. I'm a professor in psychology and neuroscience, and so kind of walk you through this. We have plenty of time for discussion too. So those of you online or in person, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. We have plenty of time. So it's not like I'm going to run through this in a full hour of information. So if you have questions, just feel to pop it. All right, so our learning objectives, we have three. First one is to list the criteria for authorship. We'll go over what that means. Second is discuss authorship attribution examples. We'll go over a couple of those, and then we'll go over figure out thoughts about like, well, somebody at Baylor will fix this, right? We'll then go over what that means. You know, what is the Baylor's procedure for authorship disputes and how they help you with that process. Okay, so this is like a snapshot of a screen. So let's say you're about to you've written your paper, you have all the data analyzed, you're ready to go, you're now at the submission level, right? So this is one recently submitted to International Journal of Developmental Neuroscience. And right, you're starting to fill in all the different categories. Hopefully, this is not the point where you say, oh yeah, authors, who should be the author on this one? Hopefully this is not the time when you're deciding who should be an author. At the very least, if you get anything out of this entire hour, is really the idea of having the discussions as early as possible, right? And so don't talk about it towards the end, at the very beginning, as best you can. Talk about the criteria, you know, and go through that as being really helpful. Hopefully you're not going at this point deciding, oh yeah, do they deserve it? Do they not? When everyone's on the paper and you promise all these things and now you have to decide. Okay, so of course, some of the authorship basics. And so for one, you know, why is authorship important? So for one, it is a way of giving everyone in your group of collaborators credit for their contribution to the research. The second part, and I'm going to really kind of hone in on this one, because I think if we kind of stick to this part, it's really helpful for alleviating some of these issues with authorship and, you know, what's allowable and not allowable, is it really holds people accountable for any questions about the research, right? So, you know, grants are always interesting because you can put your grants together and you're like, yeah, maybe this may not, you know, there's a little bit of like wiggle room, right, of what's going to really happen. But when you have an actual paper being submitted and published, right, from now until, you know, whatever, if you forget about it, I guess probably what would happen is you're accountable for it, right? So if later on they find results different than yours, even if it's a long time away, you're still accountable for it. And so it's a way of putting your stamp on there, like, I believe as best as I can tell that this data was performed correctly, we collect the data, we analyze it correctly, and I can defend it. So it's really important for that. The second one is, you know, for many of us, it's also a way to collaborate with others. And so let's say you want to work on a grant together. I hear a lot of PIs like, well, we need to first have a paper together so we can collaborate and actually get something done all the way through. It's a way of showing that you can collaborate with somebody else and you can go from beginning idea all the way to the very end, which is publication. So the second one, and then, however, the issue has become now, I mean, it's high stakes and stuff too, and so authorship is complicated, it's much complex and contentious due to, we can now add so many more authors on there, and there's really good reasons why that's okay. But whenever you start allowing more flexibility into the system, right, that's when there could be some problems, right? You might run into like, well, should I include this person? Should I not? Well, I'm adding one more to 20. Like, does it really matter? Right. And that's when you get into those issues that start to feel like, is this violating something, right? Am I somehow being dishonest about my research? Okay, and I showed this is a snapshot of our tenure track guidelines in psychology and neuroscience. And this is to show that right on here for the successful candidate, right, they need to be, you know, rate consistent publication with our peers, which is about 2.5 to 4 papers per year. So there really is a number, right, associated with the amount. And when there's a number with it, you start getting kind of desperate, that's when you may make some difficult decisions that are not going to help you long term. But we think about the number, it's important for faculty in terms of tenure track, or even when you're tenured, moving forward for promotion, that's important. For grad students, it's important because in many programs, they have to have at least 1 or 2 publications to graduate. So they don't have 1 or 2, they can't graduate, or without some difficulty for postdocs getting positions, right? So it really is a currency that we use to show productivity and, you know, what we've accomplished. And so it's a very high stakes thing when you would attach a number to it. Okay, so some of the other basics here. So there can be some examples of unethical authorship practices. One's going to be honoring authorship. And this can be giving someone authorship that really didn't have a meaningful contribution to the paper. Could be one. There can be two, which is a ghost authorship, where maybe they put a lot of work into it, but for whatever reason you forgot about them, or you decide not to include them, or they felt they should be included, you didn't include them, where there's some disagreements about whether they should be on there or not, where they should have been on there, they thought they did, but for whatever reason you decide that they would not receive authorship. Both of these will really undermine the integrity of the research, because then there are questions about if they really did do a lot, why weren't they given credit for it? There's some reason why. It can get a little shady though. Really at the end of the day, the principal investigator is the one that really decides, right? So the person who's the PI for the lab, or the head person for it, will be the one that really addresses these authorship issues. They're going to go to that person first. And you then have to think about, well, what are the guidelines I'm going to follow as being the principal investigator? Because even if you have postdocs and people on there, the more senior person will have an oversized weight of power on it. So it's really hard to say, well, I disagree with you. And they can just say, well, fine, well, I'll just take you off, right? And so as the person as the PI, it really holds quite a bit of power over the other ones. One thing too, there's a couple of different disciplines here, and I'm not sure who's on Zoom, but others as well. And this is going to vary across discipline, right? So these aren't set rules. This is just more of kind of guidance, but you have to think about within your discipline, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate for your particular discipline. Okay, so we had talked about some of these honoring ghosts and then hyper authorship, which can be common in some fields, especially like in big data or big science kind of fields where it does, there are 100 people on there. But when we think of some of these unethical practices in authorship, why do you think, what could be some cases where these might be used? Where can you think of examples where there was honoring authorship that you thought, well, is it ethical or not ethical? Or maybe it is ethical, maybe in that particular circumstance it is. But then with either one of these, what might be some of the ethical concerns for honorary ghost or hyper authorship? So any kind of discussion from you in person or online about if any of these might be used and the concerns that might be there?
I'll bring one up. Yeah, I've experienced this myself where there may be a group that you're collaborating with, especially in another country, where the questions about who should be considered an author, or the answers to that question may be a little bit different. So an example of that is where there are these maybe institutions where there's a de facto or in fact leader of an institution who's essentially listed on every single publication that comes out of the laboratories that are within that institution, even if they had absolutely nothing to do with even the intellectual contribution, you could argue for those. So yeah, that's one of those ways that I've kind of seen that play out myself.
Yeah, I remember that from PIs, but they would say that, in the European model as well, like the head person of the lab, like Max Planck has like a head person,
Yes.
and that they should be on all things. And according to our rules, would say no.
Right.
But for them, culturally wise, it's what's done.
Yeah.
Right. And then, which is okay if you're part of the culture and that's what there and people accept that. But then the flip side is if you're their collaborator and you weren't aware of that until the very end,
Right.
set somebody on there, what do you do then? What do you what did you say no, or did you?
Well, it's a difficult conversation to have then, right? Especially if it does come up later. It's not an agreed upon thing. And also if you're trying to follow, say NIH regulations and you're the corresponding author on the paper, but now suddenly you have this other institution where, again, culture or practices are a bit different, then how do you essentially comply with what are the NIH guidelines for authorship when your collaborators certainly aren't? They're not concerned about that. Let's say.
That's
yeah. In the end, you find a compromise, right? Sometimes you do capitulate because it's necessary to. For example, if you want to continue the collaboration.
Right, or they're in fear of their tenure track or something equivalent over there, and they're at risk of upsetting that person.
Yeah.
Do you want to hurt your collaborator?
Yeah.
And the answer is you should probably not let them be put on there, but that's not so.
Right.
Just say no. Yeah.
I think for ghost authorship, A few generations ago, the women and the people of color
Yeah.
were tended not to get on the papers because they weren't white men. I think that is less so now. It probably still happens to a certain extent. But a ghost authorship, so when we do systematic reviews, the librarian actually helps. We're supposed to be listed as an author, and it says that like on our help webpage, like if we do this, then we get the right to decline authorship. Like the default should be, but we think your paper's really bad, we don't necessarily want to. And even though it says that, we will have like one of the librarians, and she's too nice. Said, okay, well, this, like from our webpage, you can see this is our practice, this is standard practice. That, if I'm gonna do the searches, then I get to be an author because basically I'm collecting the data for you. And she said no. And the library was like, okay, fine, then don't be an author. The rest of us are like, you're too nice. You should either insist it or say you do it yourself.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm not gonna help you. And then she's like, well, can't I pay somebody to do that for me? I'm like, yes, the librarian is paid to do this for you, but if you want to pay extra and count them as an employee and then not include them as an authorship, right? Because then it's, work for hire,
Mhm.
right?
I didn't realize that was.
I mean, I don't know whether you could do that. I mean, do you have, if you paid them to do it, does that mean they already got their credit? Right? Because but I was like, even if you pay an outside librarian, because there are librarians who this is their job, they're consultants, I think even though you pay them, you're still supposed to include them as an author. So, but I think that's one instance, is that when somebody's collecting the data for you, and you decide that the data collection part is not deemed worthy. Have you heard of the credit statement? Yeah, so talk about
I'll go
that.
with that. Yeah. So I think they're trying to address this on multiple levels, and so I think this is going away slowly.
Yeah.
But when a person just says no, like, okay, right, then what do you do? And I think that's where, and that's great that you guys have the policy that's the default, is they should be an author, co-author on
Right.
there. And that if they want to not be a co-author, then you guys shouldn't do it for them. Just make it.
Right, and so with grad students, it can go either way. So like the psychology ones, they do the searching, and I just guide them. But in social work, often I will do the searching for them, and then before I do it, I say, make sure you ask your advisor that it's okay that I'm gonna be on the paper when,
Yeah.
and author on the paper when, you
So
publish it.
that's part of the honesty then, because otherwise it looks like they did that part of the work, which,
Right.
Yep.
especially as a graduate student.
Yeah.
The
Right.
department needs to know how much they did or didn't do.
Right, I said, I mean, it's not necessarily any different than having an undergrad help you collect your data, but they need to.
I was thinking about undergrads as an issue here,
Right.
because, sometimes I hear, because I deal with grants where,
Mhm.
you wanna say your undergrads are publishing papers, but how many of them could actually, because I think the author is supposed to be able to explain the paper.
Right.
How many of them really explained what happened in the paper, how significant was it, but also, I think from their point of view, I think sometimes if they feel like they did a significant amount, they might feel like they were ghost authored, even though honestly, they're not. That's tricky, I think.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these, the recurring theme will be talk about it ahead of time. Right, if at the very beginning you said, this is the criteria, and they say, I disagree with that, then likely we're done. Find somebody else, right? Or the same thing with undergraduates, if you talk about the criteria, and so I disagree, well then you're not on the project. However, many of us don't, it's hard to do that, but I think that helps to prevent, and that's great, you guys have that policy.
Yeah, and well, when I talk with honor students, I tell them because I meet with them at the beginning, and I ask them, talk to your advisor, are they planning on publishing this work?
Yeah.
And are you gonna be the first author, or you just like, because sometimes it's like with the grad student, and then you're sort of the middle author. And I think sometimes for, like, I've heard, like, someone was like, the first paper, you will not be, but if you're in the lab long enough to be on a second paper, then by that time, you've probably contributed enough. The first time, maybe you're still learning the ropes, but the second time a paper project that you've worked on,
Yeah,
you would be on there. You'll just be acknowledged in the first one and the second one.
Yeah, so I mean, we'll go into that too, where it's a lot of judgment calls. with these, and this is one becoming a systemic problem, right? So this is on Science Magazine on their Science Insider report. It says there's honorary authors of scientific papers abound, but they probably should not be on there. And so from this kind of study, what they found, looking at about 600,000 authors, was according to the criteria they put together, right, they were granted authorship even though they really didn't meet the commonly used criteria, or they said about 35% failed to meet the ICMJE, which I'll talk about in a second. It's just a really long name. That criteria, and then about 4% didn't meet the standards for PNAS. Right, and about 1% were on there just because they provided funding for part of it, or maybe they gave reagents or something. That was, they thought, not the bar of it. And so we're seeing a lot of honorary authorship out there. Once again, it may be that they do fit the criteria, but according to what their credit forms, what they put about how they contributed, it didn't seem like they did. And so it's just really kind of thinking about what the practice is and being careful with that. In the worst case scenario, there can be these like paper mills that are out there. And so there's been a lot of news about this, that you can actually just pay people or pay a company to be a co-author on a paper. You just give them like, I forget the amount. And I was gonna look around, but I felt weird searching here at Baylor. I was like,
Get it flagged.
yeah, yeah, so I didn't do that, but I was looking around, but they talked about it with it. And so, and I think like Hindawi had like these special journals that they would, and you know, because you get a lot of these emails all the time where like, you've been on this thing, do you want to contribute to this journal? And I'm like, I really want to. And then, you know, all this kind of stuff, right? So they're kind of predatory out there. And these paper mills, right, they estimate there's hundreds of thousands of papers produced that are really then polluting, right, the scientific literature. Because we all can recall during COVID, where everyone was citing stuff, and you find those papers and you're like, for one, it's either a preprint, or they really misinterpreted the results, right? But if it's out there, right, then they think, well, this is the truth. And it's like, no, that's not how this really works. And so but it's out there and people can, you know, report them, and it could be just fabricated data or just, you know, it's not ethical at the very least. And so then you can buy authorship to, you know, to pad your CDs. And they think approximately in 2022, you know, 2% of all scientific papers, they think, were really through these paper mill productions, right? So it's an increasing problem. There's millions to be made off of it. But for the regular person, as long as the journal sounds like a reputable name, they think it's all the same, right? The Journal of Behavioral Neuroscience and whatever, you can make up a name. It's like, oh, that sounds pretty good, right? And the lay public may not know that that's not really a good journal, or it's one that was put together quickly. And they found this in, you know, a variety of countries where you can see a lot of retractions as well, where you pay for service. And then in other countries too, there's once again other incentives for pay, right? The more you publish, the higher your salary is. So there's different incentives for those. These are the worst case scenario. So this is kind of like very extreme, but it is something to think about, and it can be kind of tempting when you're, you know, if you're at 3, you want that 4 per year, right? To kind of pad it along the way, thinking that what's the harm in doing that. And I think with a lot of these things that are, you know, I think what's really hard is that if you're then basically an honorary author on this paper, and if you do that, well then, you know, if later on they found that the data was fabricated, and you say, well, no, I just paid to be on there. It's not going to be a good argument, saying it's just like if you were in a car full of cocaine and you were just a passenger and you're like, I had no idea. So like, well, there's all this cocaine next to you. What do you mean you had no idea? Like, well, I'm just a passenger. And so when you say you're doing one illegal or unethical thing, it doesn't really protect you against the larger ethical thing. So I think thinking of it that way makes these kind of things not something you want to do, because if you're an honorary author, you just paid for it. You do run the risk that if later on they find out, and some people have been found out, some of these companies, they track everybody and they contact the university and say they purchased membership or authorship on this one, and it becomes a big deal. So you run the risk of that when you're an honorary author on this kind of format. Okay, so on other unethical practices could be, you know, one could be plagiarism, in terms of either not giving proper credit to somebody else, or in some way misrepresenting, you know, their own work or their work as well, or they put their work as your own. Could be all plagiarism. A lot of us can kind of are guilty of self-plagiarism, where, you know, you redo your methods, right, and you forgot to cite the original paper or something like that. And I know for us, we had this one paper in Frontiers last year that they had screened. And they said there's too much plagiarism here. And a lot of it was like self-plagiarism. And some of these things were like, there's no way to put those four words together. Like that's the only way to put those four words. Right. But they found like a lot of sequences of these words. We had to like rewrite some things. And like we did read, there's only so many ways you can talk about your methods you've been using forever. But it didn't meet their criteria. So we had to rewrite some stuff to be able to get through it. And so, but that one of my co-author, she was really nervous. And I think that's the difference of like tenure versus tenure track. Tenure track, she was really nervous. And I'm like, nah, it's fine. Go for it. We'll get it through, And so, but we got it through. But it was one where, they were using these programs and it's catching snippets of it and it looks like plagiarism. And then you have to be careful with that. So even if it's your own data, you have to try to rework it or be aware of it. And then what happens sometimes too, if you're in an area that's very controversial, right, you may make it sound like everyone's in agreement that this is the stuff that we found, that what is known in the field, and you forget the other camp that's really saying, no, that's not what it is at all, right? And I think that's, in some ways you feel like, well, I just want to show the stuff that's, congruent with those results, which is fair, except that you're assuming that the audience is just the people in that field, right? And it could be that it's the wider audience, right? It's not just the epilepsy people there that are looking at this, those in neuroscience, or even beyond that, maybe looking at it. And when they see a paper that doesn't cite everybody, then they think, oh, the field's pretty, they're all on board that this is the way it is. Versus in reality, there's a lot more back and forth in terms of, agreements on some things. You misrepresent the field when you have citation amnesia with it. So, but you can get away with, but it's not something that's really, it's unethical to do that. So what do we do? Right, so this is difficult because there is no one particular guideline. You can be more stringent or less stringent with it. But if you have some sort of guidelines in your lab, then, or like the policy for the library, it makes it a lot easier because you can say this is our policy, right? You can refer to that. If someone decide later on, well, I'm a ghost author, it's like, no, you didn't meet the criteria. You defend yourself by doing that. It's a lot easier when you have a criteria to use. And so you can use, I'll talk about it's like the ICMJE, right? Your conference may have, society may have guidelines. There's the APA guideline. There's a bunch of them out there. Every journal has, right, their guidelines of what's allowable for an author with it. So if you just simply use those, it's a good start. Okay, the NIH policy on it, and this is where when students are unsure about should be on there or not, I think just simply going over, this is probably a little more generous than the next set, but it's still pretty good in terms of, for one, and telling that person, did you make a substantial contribution to the conception, design, interpretation of the research? Did they do that right? And a lot of them will have collected data, but did they really, they helped with the execution part and maybe the interpretation, but maybe not quite the conceptualization of it and maybe not design. And then two, and this is probably where the light really separates out, did they review and revise the manuscript? And so you give it to them, they're like, yeah, this is good. And you're like, well, thank you, I really appreciate that. You That's okay. Yeah. And so they're, do they help with that process? And then the third, and I think a lot of problems will really be solved if we think of the third one, is you let them know, like, if you're a co-author on here, you are really taking responsibility for that research. If years down the road, they find out there was a problem with it, they may call you back, right? And so before you're just like, well, thank you for putting me on there, you have to really think about, do you feel comfortable that it represents what you think is good research and that you can defend it? If you do, then you're fine. But I think if we take Part C a little more seriously, then I think a lot of problems kind of go away. So, thinking about, do they meet these criteria? If they do meet all three, well then, yes. And then if they don't, you have to kind of decide, where's your threshold for, who should and should not be authored. Okay, the ICMJE is similar. And so it's, for one, they have potential contributions to the work, either interpretation, acquisition, interpretation. It's like the previous one here. And you think about, they involved with the drafting of it as well. They've got good insights in terms of the intellectual contribution. And then 3, wasn't in the previous one, I guess it was assumed in the NIH one, they really should approve the final version, right? And you can't just tell them like, here it is, let them know about a mark, right? You probably have to give them some time. So if you have the final one, send it out and just say, if you can, I really need to know by next Friday. If you find something that's really a problem, let me know and we'll have more time. But it's also important to give deadlines, because if not, it'll just never get submitted. But at least give them sufficient time to approve the final one. And if you want to be a real stickler, right, you can even have them sign something and be like, you approved the final one. I know some journals do require you to do that, but it's pretty rare. I've only done that a couple of times. And then, the last one here, like in the previous one, do you agree to be involved, that you agree with all the aspects of the work and that you think it's accurate? And if later on they were to investigate something, that you would feel confident that the work is genuine, that it was conducted well, as best as you know, right? It's hard to know all the data, but as best as you can tell. Any questions about these?
I'll just have a comment
Yeah.
about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
That is that there is a movement these days to get away from this 4th part or the 3rd part of the NIH sort of authorship criteria, in the sense that the nature of collaboration these days means that we might be including things in papers from collaborators that we're not trained to do, to interpret, to repeat in whatever way. And it's a bit disingenuous for an author to say, I agree to be responsible or accountable for all aspects of this work when it didn't take place in your presence, at your institution even, or do you have the expertise to even really grasp that? So there is a movement for those things to be parsed out actually during the publication process, so that later on, people don't have to say, I take full responsibility for everything, because that actually brings up an ethical issue about, can you legitimately do that always? It's easy when it's just in your group and you're doing the work and you understand all the methods of analysis, etc. It's not so easy, and these days it's becoming more complex than that. So I just bring that up to say.
No, it's okay,
Yeah, sometimes now you get all that attribution that has to be put in at the end, who did what exactly. And we've seen some very famous recent cases of this where publications have been called into questions, and significantly like important scientists have disavowed themselves of aspects of the work. I would argue successfully, right? And that brings this up as an issue too, like, is that even possible to do? And it does seem in a real practical way it's been possible to do. And I think that, that's the trend is more in that direction.
Kind of different compartments of this part,
Mhm.
And that's fair, because I mean, if you had 8 experiments on something, I'm realistically not going to go to their Excel sheet or the original images
Right.
of Western blots. And
Yes.
go all the way through just to make sure that everything's okay.
Yeah.
No one has time to do that.
Yeah, even if you do understand
yeah.
it fully, you may not look at every single nuance of the data themselves.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point with it, but I think it's, but at least you kind of think like, you've had that conversation, right? I think a lot of us don't think about this really. I don't think about it. Like, I'm happy to be on there. But then later on, you're like, well, if something does happen, am I, as best as I can, did I do my due diligence, that I feel pretty good that what was done is collective effort.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Sean.
I had a question about the 3rd bullet point. I mean, how strict is ICMJE on final approval? Because I know in many circumstances that might be the exception rather than the rule, just because, I mean, I've seen posthumous authorships, I've seen people change institutions. I feel like for most undergraduate research programs, I mean, students that graduate will often kind of disappear into the ether, and gaining final approval for a publication that is likely to occur after they've graduated is very difficult. So I'm just curious if you're familiar with how ICMJE approaches those types of circumstances. Is that something is kind of uniform within that committee?
I mean, I guess if you're, I don't know, and and honestly, I don't practice it that way either, because some people just disappear, right? Like, you can't find them, and you're like, well, I give them credit. And really, according to this, I did the wrong thing, right? I should have reached out to them. And if you can't find them, or I guess, yeah, I guess what this too is, once again, if you do this on the front end, right, and try to get people's, not just their Baylor email, but other email address before they leave. And just let them know that you're gonna be most likely on paper, we publish it on our know. But you need to, by contact, you need to let me know. And you may say that if I contact you and within a given period of time, you don't respond, I may have to review you as an author. So I think that's it's one of those things where, especially with undergraduates, it's tricky because you want to help them out. You think this is good for their career. And so you feel like it's a gift. But it is a risk for them that if something were to happen later on, there is some risk. And so, but I think it's very unlikely you can pin any like fault of the paper on an undergraduate who's there for like one semester. They're not going to be the fall guy for this, right? They're gonna be like, that was 4 years ago, and I did open field behavior. That's all I did, right? And so I think the risk is probably pretty low to that. But I think it's just one of these where just thinking ahead of time. I think discuss with your lab, just help them to.
And I think it's also final version to be published as opposed to the final version that was submitted. Because, they're like little editorial things that you really don't care about after a certain point, right? If it's a substantial R&R, that's different, but if it's just accepted with revisions, I'm assuming that it's gonna be mine. I don't necessarily, if I'm like the middle, third out of 4 authors.
Yeah.
I might not care so much.
When they give it the fruits,
But I have
like 2
like,
days.
almost all of them now send you an email saying, you've been listed as an author.
Yeah.
If you don't want to be an author, let us know now, right?
Yeah, you do have to include their emails on there, and so that's what we have usually found is like, we need to put them on there, so we found their emails and like contact people and then get it, and most of the thing for them too is they tend to be like, yeah, I don't care, it's just fine, go all the way through, but I think as long as you just let them know. And if they decide not to be a part of the process, then that's a risk, but I think just having the discussion with the group will help them to think about, a little more seriously, but my guess is I wouldn't, as an undergraduate, really think much about it, I would just get it. Yeah, so it's a discussion for them. Okay, so I'll give one example of this, and so this is kind of a famous case right now. So this is in psychology and neuroscience kind of area. So this is and I think it's famous for a couple of things because the person who did this is a Harvard professor, right? Tenured professor, and then the research is on honesty, right? So they were had fabrication on honesty, and so you're just like, oh, the irony, right? It's just wonderful. And they're at Harvard, and so people like to attack the elites, right? All this stuff, so it's amazing to do that. And so this was Francisca Gino, and she's accused of manipulating data in 4 of her papers, right? And so it's a PNS paper and lots of citations and stuff. And what they did was they found that if you sign at the very beginning of the forms that's you agree to be ethical, whatever, that if you do that, then versus the very end of the form, you tend to be more truthful. You're less likely to lie, or you're more honest if you sign at the very beginning versus the very end. So it was a really easy thing to do, but seemed to found like strong effects. That if you sign at the beginning, you're more truthful in your representation of your tax or insurance form. This blog group called Data Colada, like Pina Colada, this Data Colada, claim that you tamper with their data and make they look more impressive than they are. And so you can go into the Data Colada website, and I mean, it's really nice. They like really go all the way through the data to show like all the parts and stuff like that. So they really did their work to do that. So they put it forward, contacted Harvard. She is now suing them, the school and the bloggers, for $25 million. The bloggers had a GoFundMe. They raised like $40,000 for their lawyers and stuff, like everyone involved with this. And she's currently on unpaid leave, and Harvard seeking to revoke her tenure. I think just yesterday in the Wall Street, this paper was magazine, newspaper, that they have found like this is like 1,300 page document, and they found like, yes, she did manipulate the data. She claims like someone else out there to change the data with it. So it's ongoing, but she's very likely she's unpaid leave, and very likely to lose her tenure there. So the plot thickens because Dr. Gino is one. There's also Dr. Dan Ariely, was a co-author on there, and he's also accused of fabricating data. And so it like bled into somebody else, and that person's at Duke, and they're under investigation for him. Yeah, this snapshot of the data colada. So yeah, it's really cute with it too. So but they go out there and they like research things and see if there's fabrication or something along with it. So he's under investigation for it. This is what the paper was for. So you can see on here, so it's signed at the beginning, makes ethics salient and degrees of dishonesty, reports and compares, deciding at the end of the article. But you can see there's co-authors on there. And so the reason I know about this was because Dr. Benjamin listened to this podcast called Freakonomics and talk about like dishonesty and like academic problems and stuff like that. And they, interviewed him, and he's like, actually, he looked at the data and analyzed it, but he didn't go to the source data, right? Because I mean, who does, right? And even if you do, they don't give you like the original data. But so he did his part, but even then it wasn't sufficient. And so he's pretty much in the clear, but this has been now a multi-year process, right, to do this. And so the risk of all this, of being an author on something, is that you do run the risk of, if this were to happen, being involved with this, and it's quite the process with it, how it impacts others. And then there are other co-authors on there, and they're looking at all our papers now, or many of our papers, now impacts other collaborators, or be involved with the data trail. And if you think of your own way of putting your files together, it's probably a mess. If you do that for a whole project, it's probably a big mess, right? So going through all those files and looking at the original ones with it. But it also means that it's, the junior colleagues or undergraduates, grad students, whatever it might be, are at risk, right? There could be that's a retraction for them, even though they did nothing. Okay.
Need to pick up my child.
Okay.
I had plans for him, don't worry.
That was a fire alarm. I was like, oh no, it's another one. With it has other implications, right? So like Mike Saunders, there was this one group here, and they spent like $250,000 to run trials based on this paper, because it's a really easy thing, right? If you think just doing this at the beginning versus the end will make it more honest, you're like, well, this is an easy thing to do to see if it has large effects. But they found that, really, this is really just wasted, because it was really based upon fraudulent data, and now these interventions that people put together have been just wasted, right? And that's always the problem with these like big splash things, is that it results in lots of money and time and effort being wasted because of that. So it's an interesting saga for all this ongoing, but it just shows the risk of being co-author on some of these. And even for myself, I can think about when I was a postdoc at Baylor College of Medicine. The first year I was there in 2004, and at the time, one of the PIs there, the postdoc just left because they found out he had fabricated data on one of their science papers, and then they had just retracted it. So this is from her PubMed here. And so it was a long time ago, and she's gone on, her career is great, and she's at, I think, still Rutgers, so she's really good. But still, once you have that retraction, it's on your PubMed forever, right? So someone can always go back and be like, oh, there was that checkered history, kind of back then. So those don't go away. And if you're a new grad student professor, and that's your first citation, doesn't look good, right? And kind of scare people away if they see that on your citation. Yeah.
So, do you think it makes a difference whether you self-retract or somebody else finds it?
I don't know. I mean,
Like, or if you find it first, you not do a retraction, you do a.
like addendum or
An addendum
random,
or
yeah,
correction.
or like a random, right? Is what they call it. Yeah. I mean, those look better. I mean, if you find out, yeah, we didn't quite do this right, I think that's fine. But it's hard. I think for most people, they see that, they just think it's bad, right? So I think the nuance can get lost for most people. But I think if you're proactive about it and you find it, then I think it's okay.
But you're not, probably not gonna get
Yeah.
fired for it at least.
Yeah, but like for this person, people it was like a really hot thing in the field back then, and people were saying, oh yeah, it's all made up. And they found it for them. And so they made them retract it because they did investigation, found out this application. So yeah. Either way, like, so the postdoc was like with this. So, but like I said, 6th round for quite a while. So when you think about significant intellectual contribution, you can have this list here, and a lot of the credit ones do that as well. Like, where did they have contribution? Did they design experiments? Did they perform it, collect data, analyze? construction of the arguments, with the first draft, and so, kind of cataloging some of these. Can be very helpful to determine, where they should go. With it, and then just sort of like for the field, right, we think of at least for our field, right, the senior author, the last author is generally the PI, and the first is the one who did a lot of the work, or did the most contribution. And then, the co-authors where it gets a little tricky, like, what is the list? It's like, well, you kind of try to do it probably the first like 2 or 3, like second, third, or probably by order of who did this much work. Once you get past the third, it's really hard to know, like, I mean, they all kind of did the same. And so you may prioritize grad students then, but really in the end, it doesn't seem to matter that much with it. But you can order if you think it's more fair to do that. Okay. So I think one thing we tend to not use a whole lot, right, is acknowledgements. And so we, giving credit to people who were involved with like, advising how to analyze the data or collecting the data or modifying, they did some code for you, if they provided funding, did some kind of quick observations for you. And I think, maybe one kind of solution could be where, on your data, you can put like an acknowledgement section where you say, this is where I helped in other projects where I didn't meet the criteria for authorship, but I still was involved. I think for us, if you're acknowledged, you don't tend to think much about it. You're like, I was on there, but I didn't do a whole lot. And just like with acknowledgements, you wouldn't put NIH or NSF on all your grants because they didn't do the work. So if the person only provided funding, like the PI in the lab didn't really do anything else, then it's more appropriate to put that person there. I think it's unlikely to happen, but I think would be fair to do that. Okay, so I wanted to go over, we'll kind of just read them together here. So you can think about it in the following, where it's contribute to a phase 2 clinical trials, should have been named as an author on the paper or only in the acknowledgement. So the first one is Dr. S, the principal investigator who designed, studied, interpret the data, and critically edited the manuscript. Do you think author or acknowledgement? I think I had out pretty good. Right, and then Dr. T, a clinical fellow who helped design, study, interpret data, and perform physical examinations, and wrote the first draft of the manuscript. Author. Ms. C, a research nurse who obtained informed consent from participants, collected blood samples, and other clinical data, administered medications, and critically read the paper. I mean, yeah, that's where we're getting a little more gray, right? So, depending on where you want to put them on, Dr. Y, statistician, who analyzed data.
It depends.
Yeah, if they did a couple of t-tests, but if they did a very complicated analysis that without which you couldn't publish the paper, then was a really.
Or they wrote up the section.
Yeah, the whole thing, yeah, and that's really important, right?
You could write up those 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, that's a lot, yeah, because if you don't have to analyze the data for that particular thing, then you wouldn't be able to publish that work. So here, Dr. E, who developed and provided the monoclonal antibodies used in the study and gave critical feedback on the paper.
Well, the antibodies been published previously is one thing, so is there an expectation that they're just available to the research community? There are all kinds of questions around that, right? Are they commercially available then? Are they making a profit off of that? Critical feedback can mean many different things.
I mean, you acknowledge your reviewers because they give critical feedback.
Right. Yeah, the reviewer, I don't get to be a co-author on the paper. That would be nice. Yeah, so I think, however, if they Dr. E designed these antibodies for this project,
Right.
that would be different. So I think like on the surface, you're like, well, no, or you think yes. But I think it just depends. If they've had them, if no one else has made them, they have these antibodies around for 10 years, it's like, I don't think, they're just giving you their frozen antibodies, right? It's not super helpful. What about here, radiologists who interpreted clinical images for the study, but did not read the paper?
You didn't even read it?
Right.
Right?
I mean, that's probably their job anyway, right? Interpreting clinical images paper, right? They do that anyway. If they're collecting that data just for putting it in patient information, then it's probably sufficient that they got paid to do that. And that's probably good for the patients anyway.
Acknowledgement.
Yeah, so you can acknowledge. So I think that's a good one for acknowledgements where you really appreciate it. But I think once again, to not make people mad, let them know ahead of time, right? Like if you want to be an author, you really need to help with like the analysis, making that kind of clear. I think will make your life a bit easier. So I won't go over all of these, but from this like green to magenta, what you can see is for many of these like contributions, authorship and comments, right, it's gonna really depend on, it's this gray area, right? So did they supervise and did a lot of, and actually involved the project? Yes, there should be a full-time author on there. If they provide just general training in the lab but didn't do anything else, probably not. All right, so with a lot of these, it just depends on kind of where they fit. In terms of if it's more like yes or more no, no being kind of magenta area here across the different roles, whether even a data acquisition, a little more technical, if they just ran like genotyping in the lab, should they be on all the things that animals are genotyped for? Probably not. But it just depends. If they have to do a lot of genotyping, well, maybe they should, right? If it's really complicated, like, triple knockout, and they have to do like 100 samples every other week. That's probably enough to be, co-authors. It just depends on what they fit. But I think too, what really will help to, I think for you, it'll help in terms of making it clear, but also for them to be more involved, like we were saying earlier. Can they explain the paper? Right, so if they're not helping with this writing and other part, they probably can't really explain a whole lot. And it really is difficult when in med school interviews and grad school interviews. It's, oh, you're an author, I know what you do. Well, I got the mouse and I put it in a cage, I left the room. And that doesn't really inspire confidence that they're gonna be a really good grad student in your program. I tell my lab too, is like, you really need to tell them what's the story behind this, right? So you can, it's much easier to do that if you've actually read it and provided some feedback, then you'll be in this authorship here. If you just sort of work hands in the lab, they have to be there, it's probably not sufficient to put them on there. There are some scorecards out there you can use. I've never used one of these. And so you can think of, and this is kind of fun for some people because they kind of gamify where they're at. If you're going to do this though, I guess pick a number you think is, you put like 100, they can just do this one thing and then like they're done, right? So, but I think there could be a way of kind of letting them know, is it reaching the threshold of being an author? And I think it's where this may be valuable for one, just being ethical, but for two, it gets them buy-in to that. To want to know more about the project and care about it. Because I think when they can't talk about it as a PI, it's really frustrating when your undergraduates not being able to talk about the stuff that they've been doing for the last 2 years. Like, what are you thinking the whole time you're doing this? Like, you're not thinking. And and then later on they are, but it's a little frustrating at the time. So in terms of resolution, right, there can be, there's no set of standards, like if you hit this, it's resolved or not. Really, a lot of things can really be addressed if you really have the discussion right before and during the process, right? So as you're going through it, talk about the beginning, throughout that process. There are some formal kind of disputes that you can look at, see what the criteria for it. In terms of like, well, I'll let Baylor worry about this. I'll talk to, someone, Deborah Holland or somebody else or general counsel. That's not their job. Right, their job is to say like, you go to the department, right? And I'm sure our department chair or your department chair, biology, doesn't want nothing to do with this. So they'll say, talk to the PI, right? And so I think that's what's gonna trickle back down with it, unless it really gets out of hand, well then make it involved, but it's really gonna be a departmental level involvement for this kind of resolution. So like I said, some of the guidelines here are gonna be to prevent a lot of these things. Discuss authorship on the outset and revisit them as necessary. Sometimes projects, you get rid of things or add things. But when that happens, we have to reconsider who should be an author and who should not be an author. And once again, the order should be some kind of an indicator of their work that they contributed for it. And especially can, convey to them that you're going to be an accountable author. So once again, it's just more buy-in. So I think for the most part, people aren't being unethical. I think it's a good way to get them more involved with it, is the way I kind of see it more than to prevent lawsuits. I don't think that's the best way to do things. But other things are, if it's their main project, they should obviously be the first author on it. And then, state the contributions to the other one and at least have one person that's the main. Generally it's the PI, because most grad students and postdocs will then leave to go somewhere else and their emails are going to change or they're hard to find. If they go into the corporate world, you never see them again, right? They're really hard to find. They just kind of disappear. Okay, so at this point, wanted to give some time just to kind of show this here and let you kind of read it. And then we'll just discuss together as one scenario. And we'll just kind of go through these next examples. Okay. Okay, so what should the student do?
Really, I mean, if who are they gonna go to, their mentor?
Yeah.
I mean. You know, they're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
There's a power imbalance,
Yeah.
right? You know, and if I was a student, I'd be like, okay, that's fine. Like I'm constantly ruckus. Also, that the person's dead. So what are they gonna do? With it, so.
I might go to GPD and see if they have any suggestions. Like have another faculty person talk to.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
the chair, as opposed to, yeah,
That would be good. So, and ideally, someone else who has equal power to that chair,
Yeah.
not tenure track, because that's gonna be difficult. I mean, they can, speak out and they should. But yeah, so maybe talk to someone else who can be their advocate for those students. What should the new mentor have done?
Not deleted the.
I just don't know why you would do that.
Yeah,
I just don't.
I mean, you can add yourself on if you did some substantial work, although it doesn't seem like they did anything, but.
Yeah.
right, well, because sometimes people, they tell the students, well, my name's on it, it's more likely to get published, but not if you have blind review, but.
No one's that famous, right? I mean, there's a few people that are, I'm not that famous, and they're like, oh, it's Lugo, that's, that was just
Right,
stale
and that-
true.
I mean, that's what they told us, when I
Yeah,
was
it's
in
a lie.
school, right? Now that I'm older, I realize it's not true, but I would have believed that when I was
Yeah, yeah.
a student, right? Like, you'll get a desk reject unless my name's on it. Right? Or if you just do it by yourself without the deceased person, you'll get desk reject because it's a single off paper.
Yeah.
If you're in a science field, like now, if you're in humanities, they don't care.
That's, yeah, that's like, I mean, the chair shouldn't have done that, right? That's the thing, right? The
Right.
chair should know this, it shouldn't have happened. Should it be, granted authorship, mostly once they've passed away?
yes, I've been involved in it, actually. Yes,
I would think so.
Yeah.
It might be that somehow they need someone at the university to be the corresponding author, but I'm sure there's gotta be some way to do that,
well,
but
yeah, I
yeah.
mean,
How
yeah,
they
even
don't-
beyond the corresponding authorship, right, you're just saying, as an authorship. And that's clearly the case, and then that's a way to note that actually in the author list, that this authorship is posthumous. And that's. That happens fairly routinely.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's another avenue that a graduate student would have, and that's to go to the editor of the journal.
Mhm.
I'm an associate editor, I guarantee you, if someone raised that issue with me or the editor, it would be a major thing. Like people, so no reputable journal is going to want to publish something where something like this has happened now. They may not want to get involved in the adjudication of that,
Right.
but they're likely to distance themselves from the publication right from the get-go if they know about that.
But then that's.
The dropping of the.
Yes, the dropping of
of
the
the
author, who's down.
But then the graduate student might need that publication, so they may not want to.
That's right, but
Yeah.
yeah, they're not powerless in the situation.
No, they're
I
not.
admit to you that there's hierarchical order here,
Right.
yes, but they are not powerless in that situation.
Yeah.
If they understand the levels of accountability and people that they could reach out to raise the issue. And it's always the publisher is a level that can be raised.
Yeah, let's do one more of these.
Yeah.
For. Good going, for sort of here. That's a long one, but. Yeah, I'll do this one. They should go first.
It's complicated. After clients, right? I mean, isn't it? Is
Yeah.
this maybe the very first one?
For the last.
The client's the one who's the PI, so I guess that's the,
Is he gonna be first? I mean,
it'll be probably last,
he'll
right?
probably be last, but that's one way to fix it, is to put himself first.
Well, but then he says the other person that's. Plus all the new data, so.
Well, the first mistake is promising, right? You
Yeah.
don't promise anything in terms
Right.
of authorship ahead of
At
time.
this point, this is probably the way it's going to be, right?
Yeah, that's a discussion, like this looks like how it will be, but that has to be
Yeah.
decided on submission.
the right before submission.
So that's really important that in those
Oh.
initial discussions, that you don't make any hard
Correct.
promises.
Yeah, that's my,
But and it's also hard though, because you may not make that hard promise, but they may hear,
it can be interpreted.
yeah, that's hard.
You may say like, oh, this looks like pretty good. It looks like you're probably first author. They hear definitely first author on this, right? So I think, yeah, being kind of tentative about things is very helpful. Like you said, sometimes they're gonna still hear first author,
Yeah.
but you know, if it changed enough that the other person have really contributed to it a lot, and I tell my own students like, may do a lot, but if this person gets it to the end, because data collection is hard. But honestly, writing it up and get to the end, I think it's harder. So, yeah, if they got to the end, they should get first author and you should be second or down the road. So,
Well, if he's leaving, that's when you have that conversation.
Yeah.
You're not here to finish the paper, so.
Yeah.
We need to let you know that where you're at, paper.
Yeah.
Although it's hard, though, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
other things happening, you're not necessarily.
But also the-
Several pages, yeah.
The discussion is predicated on the original data set, which was changed significantly. So that, of course, constitutes another new discussion. So,
Yeah.
but I think to your initial points, like if you have these things kind of written out as a policy that everyone knows coming in, that there will be discussions about this, open discussion. That can help. It's not a perfect solution, but it can help.
no, but I think just with a lot of these here for like criteria for like we're the last slide here. On authorship, it's just thinking about, you know, what's gonna fit the criteria of it, but then I think just communicating. So I think, and I found that too, you know, my first year versus like I am now, I'm much more open about things, I actually know what I'm doing. Right, and I also, like, I'm very sensitive to it because as a postdoc, you know, the first author was really, it was musical chairs. And so as the last person holding the paper was first author, which is not the way to do things. But because of that, I'm very sensitive to authorship, and so I put a lot of effort into it because I don't want them to feel like I did all this work, but the last guy that wrote it got all the credits, which I did sometimes because I took it, I mean, once I took advantage, I knew the situation and I knew how to work with it. But it's not fair. But that's just, that was, you know, what are you gonna do? So I think, you know, knowing the criteria, thinking about what people are involved, is really important. In terms of the last one here, right, Baylor's not really part of that, right? It's gonna be the department. And this is where it's gonna fall on you, as the PI, is you need to be a little more proactive. And I think if you do that, most problems will be solved. I've never really had a problem with authorship problems. I've never had that in my lab, because we discuss it and we'll say, so, well, you know, if, you know, who wants to be first author, then we have the criteria not set. And they look at the criteria, they're like, it's kind of a lot of work, right? And then the other person does it, and then it's all versus, yeah, but I think making it really clear is very helpful. Right, so right at 4 o'clock, so I don't want to keep you beyond that time. Any other last thoughts or questions? Yeah, Jeff.
So I was very intrigued by the slides you presented with the heat maps and the scorecard, because I've long been a strong advocate for data driving policy.
Yeah.
This is maybe a naive question. So I know a lot of publishers, or a lot of journals are now requiring that we explicitly mention author contributions in our manuscripts. Do we know if the publishers or the journals actually use that information to help inform or guide, like at least update their guidelines as to inform the fields in general as to how we should approach this? Because I mean, I don't like doing busy work, but that seems like busy work unless that information is actually useful for something. I feel like that could be something that could be analyzed, right, and reviewed. Because at this stage, I feel like it's just sort of a publisher's attempt to defer any sort of ownership or you know, responsibility for this issue in particular. But I know it doesn't really it's really not important until it becomes important.
Right.
And ultimately, I think it does impact, you know, really significant components of science, right, in general, or academia in general. I'm just curious if anyone is familiar with what that information, or how, or if that information is actually being used for something like that.
I think there's an attempt.
Okay,
So I live in the bibliometrics world, which is measuring impact of publications. And everything is supposed to be linked. That is the goal of the government, is to make sure that everything is linked, right? And I believe that at some point in the metadata for these articles,
Oh, okay.
it's gonna show up, and once it's in the metadata for the articles, then they can start tracking it, and it can, things can get pushed to your ORCID or, you know, in other places. So I don't think it's happening right now. So the one that I've heard of is credit.
Yeah.
See this one, with 14 contributor roles. And so even if you're not an author, you're still, you're supposed to highlight them, and so even if you're not an author, it'll still get pushed to your profiles.
So can I ask, is that something that is put in the supplementary documents that you submit with, or is it actually in the paper itself?
In the paper, now it's in paper.
Okay.
Yeah, so
So
yeah,
they credit
Is it out
statement.
the paper, or is it like?
it's at the end, so they'll have like an acknowledgements, they'll have where you can find the data statement, they'll have like the, you know, funding, or they have the funding statement, it's sort of all of the end right before the references. Now they, you know, there could easily be 6 different things, like conflict of interest, conflict of interest statement, like just all of these things that you had to sort of.
Is it typical within the paper to explain who did what at all?
No.
Because when I do grants, and so in grants, I really ask people to be very explicit. Who's
Right.
If there's, when we're talking about, you know, different disciplines.
Right.
To make it clear, but that isn't, I guess, in paper writing.
No, it'll be,
Because I think that would, especially if there's a dispute, it would say, well, who was it that actually? But
Yeah.
maybe if you have this list at the bottom, it basically. helps.
yeah, so I think it's a slow moving
Okay.
thing. I would say it would come before you retire.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll come before you get. I don't think it'll come before you get tenure. It might come before you get full though.
Well, then now they can go back and reanalyze and like, look at this data and see the criteria, right? So it might be able to analyze.
How they were able to figure it out.
Yeah, yeah, but I guess. So I think that data is out there. I think they're doing more with it, but I think like these discussions are why NIH wants these things, right? So let's talk about
Yeah, so I think what will happen is that they're waiting, once something has. Once they decide what the rules are. Then they can program it in, but right now, like, there's all these different rules, but like once. A influential enough body adopts. Or 2 or 3 of them adopt one of them. Then it'll trickle, yeah, pretty quickly.
Yeah, I was chuckling at your citation amnesia. Because this happens sometimes too. I know we're all regularly. Is that a reviewer will say, oh, you should cite this,
Yeah.
this, and this. Now, sometimes they're right, and other times they're not, in my opinion, right, and it feels like they're maybe trying to get their own citations or friends, and so that's
Yeah.
another kind of like.
Or they
insidious-
want like journals that are part of their journals.
Yeah, maybe so.
Being cited to kind of help their.
Yeah, yeah.
index.
And what do you do about that? Because, you know, if you can try to disagree with the reviewer and that, but that makes it more challenging to get your.
Yeah, you just feel like that on there.
Well, it depends
Yeah.
on whether the associate or agreed, because sometimes like,
Yes.
these are vanity citations.
Yeah.
It could be if they're looking at that carefully.
But then sometimes people will cite the opposite,
Mhm.
they cite, because everybody cites, and they've never read the paper,
Yeah.
right, and that's just as bad. It's to
I
cite something that you've never actually read, because, you know, there's some old paper that was written in German.
Right.
1940s that everybody cites, if they're doing work in this area, but nobody actually has.
Or they'll say like, I did the methods in this paper, and you go to that paper, cite another paper. Then like, you don't find the original methods.
Yeah.
So that's really frustrating.
Yeah.
It's like. Yeah, so there's that too, where they just get lazy.
Yeah.
I think that's probably more likely.
But text recycling should be another topic. I'm like,
Yeah, so now, I mean, hope it's been a good discussion, but yeah, thanks for your input too. It's more fun.
Yeah.
Having heard
It's
your
really
input, too.
interesting. Thank you very much.
Happy to do it.
That's a really important topic.
were there people
Never easy.
who joined online? Did just reply?
No comments. Does anyone have anything? Oh, unmuted.
Anyone else have comments? Oh, there was one chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, okay. Stop share.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Did you record this?
Yes. Can I exit or?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.